Let's talk about LDAP authentication with the enterprise version of MongoDB. LDAP, the Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, is a directory service protocol commonly used within companies. With LDAP authentication support, users can authenticate to MongoDB using their LDAP credentials. MongoDB communicates to an LDAP server via the SASL proxy service. We'll configure SASL such that it can connect to our LDAP server, and then we'll be able to connect our MongoD to the SASL via a Unix socket. It's important to note that MongoDB uses the SASL plain mechanism for communicating with the clients, thus sending and receiving data over plain text. You can configure how SASL auth communicates to the LDAP server, but by default, this will also communicate via plain text. This means it's in our best interest to run this setup on a trusted channel, such as a connection that is encrypted with TLS or over a trusted wired network. I'm going to assume you already have MongoDB Enterprise installed and have an LDAP server up and running. I'd like to point out that my LDAP server in MongoD will be running on the same machine for this demonstration. I'm currently SSH'd into an Ubuntu machine, so keep in mind that some of my commands will be slightly different from yours depending on your flavor of Linux. Let's go ahead and install SASL. Here I'm running apt-get, and I'm installing SASL bin, and we're going to say yes, and this will install SASL. Cool. Now that that's been installed, we can go ahead and configure SASL to talk to LDAP. Here I'm using vim to modify my SASL configuration, and I'm running vim under sudo, and that's because we're modifying something that's in the etc directory. And from here, we need to go ahead and say that we want start to be yes, and after that, we want to change this mechanism from PAM to LDAP. Awesome. Now let's go ahead and save this file. Now that SASL is configured to talk to LDAP, we need to go ahead and specify some specifics about our setup. Here I'm going to go ahead and create a file called sasl.config underneath etc, and I'm going to again need to use sudo because it's under the etc directory. So in here we can go ahead and configure some stuff. So since my LDAP server is running on my local machine, it's localhost and it's running on the default port. And my search space I'm going to specify it as mongodb.com. And then for my actual LDAP filter, my users are going to be filtered by UID. We can go ahead and save this. And now we can go ahead and start the SASL service. And here's the command to do so. And now the daemon's been started. Now that we have our configuration all set up, we can go ahead and do the next thing, which is changing the permissions on this folder. And I had to run sudo, by the way, because this is another special folder. And this folder is special because there's this file called mux. And this mux is actually a Unix socket. And this is the socket that will allow MongoD to communicate with SASL, which will then forward our messages over to our LDAP server. So we're going to go ahead and run chmod on this folder so that MongoD can actually access this mux. Awesome. Now that we have changed these permissions, we can go ahead and verify that SASL can communicate with our LDAP server by running test SASL. And here I'm going to run SASL, and on my LDAP server I have a user named Kirby, whose password is LDAP, and then I'm specifying that mux, and we get OK success. Awesome. Now that we verified that SASL can talk to our LDAP server, let's go ahead and configure MongoDB to talk to this SASL. Now that we have everything configured, we can go ahead and get MongoDB up and running with LDAP authentication enabled. Here's the command to do so. We're going to go ahead and enable authorization. We're going to go ahead and set a parameter. We can set the authentication mechanism to plain. We're going to set SASL path to the mux we've been using. And then, of course, dpath, log path, and fork. Awesome. Now that our server is up and running, we can go ahead and connect to it. Now we should be able to run show dbs and get an error, and we do, as expected. And now we can go ahead and take advantage of the localhost exception and create our first user. Here I'm going to use the external database because LDAP is an external authentication mechanism. And I'm going to create a user called Kirby because that's the user we're using, and he's going to be our root on the admin database. Sweet. The user's been created, and now we can go ahead and try and authenticate. I'm first going to try with a password that we know is incorrect. We know that my password is LDAP, but I'm going to use the password LDAP2. And we get authentication failed. And now I'm going to run it again, but with my correct password being LDAP. And we see that it ran successfully. Awesome. We now have a MongoDB enterprise server up and running with LDAP authentication enabled.